A new report from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York confirms what economists have been saying all along. Americans are paying for almost all of President Donald Trump's tariffs.
That Americans are bearing nearly all the costs of Trump's recent tariff hikes, the study estimating that about 90% of the import taxes are paid by U.S. consumers and businesses, not foreign exporters.
90%. That's how much of Donald Trump's tariff bill was paid by Americans. Not China, not Canada, not Mexico. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York released the data on February 12, 2026, and it destroyed Trump's entire narrative. For a year, he claimed foreign countries would absorb the cost. They'll pay, he said, not Americans. The numbers proved him wrong, and one day later, Trump blinked. This report breaks down why Trump's tariff strategy backfired, what the NY Fed exposed, and what happens when a president's signature policy collapses under economic reality. Here's why this matters right now. Trump is quietly planning to roll back his steel and aluminum tariffs after voters felt every cent. It could reshape his economic credibility 9 months before midterm elections. And the next move may determine whether his never back down brand survives. If you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Trump promised. On April 2nd, 2025, a day he called Liberation Day, Trump declared a national emergency over the trade deficit and imposed sweeping tariffs on nearly all U.S. imports. A minimum 10% tariff took effect on April 5th, but that was just the beginning. On June 4th, 2025, Trump doubled the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50% for most countries. The White House claimed it was necessary to protect national security and American industry. Canada, the top supplier of steel to the United States, was hit hard. Mexico, the second largest aluminum supplier, faced the same 50% rate. The European Union, South Korea, Brazil, all subjected to the new levy. Then, in August 2025, the Commerce Department expanded the tariff list to include 407 additional product categories: wind turbines, mobile cranes, bulldozers, rail cars, furniture, dishwashers, refrigerators, washing machines, dryers, ovens, fire extinguishers. The tariffs now covered steel and aluminum. Derivatives, products that contained the metals, not just pure steel or aluminum itself. By November 2025, the average tariff rate on U.S. imports had jumped from 2.6% to 13%. The Treasury Department collected $287 billion in tariff revenue in 2025, a 192% increase from the previous year. Trump touted the number as proof that his strategy was working. Billions of dollars, largely from countries that have taken advantage of the United States for many years, laughing all the way, will start flowing into the USA, he posted. But here's what Trump didn't say. Who was actually paying those billions? The administration insisted that foreign exporters would absorb the cost. In a January 30th, 2026 Wall Street Journal op-ed, Trump wrote, "The data shows that the burden, or incidence, of the tariffs has fallen overwhelmingly on foreign producers and middlemen, including large corporations that are not from the U.S. He argued that countries dependent on exports had no choice but to eat with the tariffs to avoid even worse losses. That claim was about to be tested. On February 12, 2026, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York released a study that analyzed tariff data from the U.S. Census Bureau and foreign trade statistics through November 2025. The findings were devastating. Nearly 90% of the tariff's economic burden fell on U.S. firms and consumers. From January to August 2025, U.S. importers bore 94% of tariff costs. By November, foreign exporters were shouldering just 14%. The rest, 86%, was still paid by Americans. The report was clear. U.S. firms and consumers continue to bear the bulk of the economic burden of the high tariffs imposed in 2025. That's when everything changed. The New York Fed's report didn't just challenge Trump's narrative, it obliterated it. The study revealed a simple economic reality. When faced with tariffs, foreign exporters did not lower their prices. Instead, they passed the cost directly to U.S. importers, who then passed it to manufacturers, retailers, and ultimately American consumers. The tariff acted like a consumption production tax on imports, reducing the variety and volume of goods available while driving up prices at every stage of the supply chain. Here's how the mechanism worked. A steel importer in Ohio purchases aluminum sheets from Canada. Before June 2025, the cost was $1,000 per ton. After the 50% tariff, the cost jumped to $1,500. The Canadian exporter didn't drop their price to compensate. The Ohio importer absorbed the $500 increase, or passed it to their customers. An appliance manufacturer in Michigan buys those aluminum sheets to produce refrigerators. They face the same $500 markup. They pass it to wholesalers. Wholesalers pass it to retailers. Retailers pass it to you. By the time a refrigerator reaches a consumer in Pennsylvania, the original $500 tariff has cascaded through multiple layers, compounding the final price increase. The Tax Foundation estimated that Trump's tariffs would increase the average American household's tax burden by $1,300 in 2026, wiping out the $1,000 benefit from Trump's earlier tax cuts. And it wasn't just appliances. Ovens got more expensive. Washing machines, steel cans, pie tins, food and drink cans, wind turbines, construction materials. The Commerce Department's August expansion meant that 400 plus product categories now carried the 50% tariff on their steel or aluminum content. Manufacturing supply chains, already strained, were hit with input cost increases that they couldn't absorb. A Michigan auto parts manufacturer told Bloomberg in August, "We're paying 50% more for steel, and we can't pass all of it to customers without losing contracts." But what Trump didn't expect was how voters would react. A Reuters/Ipsos poll conducted in early February 2026 found that just 30% of Americans approved of Trump's handling of the rising cost of living. 59% disapproved, including 9 in 10 Democrats and 1 in 5 Republicans. That Republican disapproval was the warning sign. Trump's base was feeling the pain. Farmers in Iowa saw input costs rise for equipment made with steel. Home builders in Arizona faced higher prices for construction materials. Small business owners in Wisconsin couldn't afford new machinery. The cost of living crisis was no longer an abstract political talking point. It was real, and it was hitting Trump's core supporters. Here's the part nobody is talking about. The tariffs didn't just hurt consumers. They devastated American exporters. Canada, Mexico, and the European Union imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods. American farmers lost access to key markets. Soybean exports to China collapsed. Pork producers in North Carolina faced 25% tariffs in Canada. The trade war Trump started to protect American industry was now crushing it from both sides. Higher input costs at home, blocked export markets abroad, and then came the political earthquake. On February 11th, 2026, one day before the New York Fed report, the U.S. House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to terminate Trump's tariffs on Canada. 6 Republicans defied Trump's live threat and voted with Democrats. The bill wouldn't pass the Senate, and Trump would veto it anyway. But the message was clear. Trump's own party was starting to crack. Representatives Don Bacon, Nebraska; Brian Fitzpatrick, Pennsylvania; Thomas Massey, Kentucky; Will Hurd, Colorado; Kevin Kiley, California; and Dan Newhouse, Washington, all from districts where tariff pain was acute, voted against their president. What happened next caught Washington completely off guard. On February 13th, 2026, just one day after the New York Fed report, the Financial Times reported that Trump was planning to scale back some of his steel and aluminum tariffs. Officials in the Commerce Department and U.S. Trade Representative's office told the FT that the tariffs were hurting consumers by raising prices for goods including pie tins, food and drink cans, ovens, and washing machines. The administration was reviewing the list of products affected by the levies and planned to exempt some items, halt the expansion, and launch more targeted national security probes instead of blanket tariffs. The White House response was defensive. A spokesperson said Trump will never compromise on reinvigorating the domestic manufacturing that is critical to our national and economic security, especially steel and aluminum production. But the denial couldn't hide the reality. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent downplayed the potential rollback, saying any changes were up to Trump. The American Iron and Steel Institute urged the administration to maintain the tariffs, warning that government-subsidized excess steel capacity in China was a threat to U.S. national security. security. But the pressure was mounting. Voters were furious. The midterm elections were just 9 months away. November 2026. Affordability was expected to be the dominant issue, and Trump's approval rating on cost of living was collapsing. A December 2025 CBS/YouGov survey found that 63% of Americans opposed placing new tariffs on goods from other countries. 68% said tariffs drove up prices in 2025. 59% expected tariffs to drive up prices in 2026. The data was overwhelming. Trump's signature economic policy, the one he claimed would make America rich, was turning into his biggest liability. But here's what Trump really didn't anticipate. While he threatened Canada with 50% tariffs, Canada didn't bend. Prime Minister Mark Carney called the tariffs unlawful, unjustified, and illegal. He said Canada was in intensive negotiations with the US, but was also preparing reprisals if those negotiations failed. Canada retained its own retaliatory tariffs on $90 billion worth of US goods. And while Trump was focused on tariff wars, Carney was diversifying. In September 2025, Canada signed a comprehensive economic partnership agreement with Indonesia, its first bilateral deal with an ASEAN nation. In October and November 2025, Carney visited Malaysia for the ASEAN Summit, met with Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, and attended the APEC Summit in South Korea. Canada was pivoting to Asia, the region representing 60% of global GDP and a $500 billion investment target. The message was clear. Canada outlasted Trump. While the US economy buckled under the weight of its own tariffs, Canada found new markets. And now Trump was the one backing down first. This isn't just about Canada. This is about what happens when the world's largest economy weaponizes trade policy without understanding the consequences. While Trump was locked in a tariff war with allies, America's adversaries were watching and capitalizing. China, which Trump claimed to be punishing, found new opportunities. As US-Canada trade tensions escalated, Chinese state media highlighted the instability of American alliances. Beijing positioned itself as a more reliable partner for countries seeking trade diversification. When Canada signed its Indonesia deal in September 2025, Chinese officials publicly praised the move as evidence that the era of US economic dominance is ending. Russia benefited even more directly. Arctic sovereignty, a strategic priority for Canada, became a pressure point. While Trump threatened Canada over steel tariffs, Russia expanded its Arctic military presence. Canadian Defense Minister Wayne Ayers' February 2nd, 2026 statement that Canada must keep options open on nuclear weapons wasn't about abstract geopolitical theory. It was a direct response to the breakdown of trust with the United States. Trump's tariffs weren't just economic policy, they were eroding the NORAD partnership, the 67-year-old defense alliance that protects North American airspace. The European Union, meanwhile, was finalizing its own response. In June 2025, when Trump doubled the steel and aluminum tariffs, the EU announced it was preparing expanded countermeasures that would automatically take effect if no resolution was reached. By February 2026, those countermeasures were still in the pipeline, but the EU was also accelerating talks with Latin America. On February 7th, 2026, the European Commission backed a landmark trade deal with Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The deal created one of the largest free trade zones in the world, covering over 700 million people. The timing wasn't coincidental. As Trump isolated the United States with tariffs, the EU was building new alliances to fill the vacuum. And then there's the Supreme Court wildcard. Multiple legal challenges to Trump's tariff authority were consolidated into Learning Resources versus United States, with a ruling expected in mid-February 2026 if the court struck down Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose tariffs. The Treasury Department could be forced to refund billions in collected revenue. The Congressional Budget Office had already slashed its estimate of expected tariff receipts for the decade by $1 trillion in anticipation of a negative ruling. If Trump lost in court, the entire tariff regime could collapse overnight. And with it, his claim that tariffs were balancing the budget. What officials didn't say publicly was the long-term damage to American credibility. NATO allies were watching. South Korea and Japan, which rely on US security guarantees, were questioning whether a president who punished allies over trade disputes would honor defense commitments. The precedent Trump set, using national security laws to impose economic penalties on friends, was irreversible. Even if Trump rolled back the tariffs, the message had been sent. American alliances were transactional, not strategic, and that message would outlast Trump's presidency. Trump wanted leverage. He got liability. He wanted foreign countries to pay. Americans paid 90%. He said, I never back down. He's backing down. The New York Fed report didn't just expose the cost. It exposed the LIE. For a year, Trump told voters that his tariffs would punish China, Canada, and Mexico while enriching the U.S. Treasury. The data proved the opposite. U.S. firms and consumers absorbed $287 billion in tariff costs in 2025. Costs that cascaded through supply chains, raised prices on everything from refrigerators to pie tins, and turned Trump's tax cuts into a tax increase. And now, with midterm elections 9 months away and only 30% of Americans approving his handling of the cost of living crisis, Trump is quietly planning to roll back the tariffs that his own Commerce Department admits are hurting consumers. Canada didn't bend. Canada diversified. Prime Minister Mark Carney signed deals with Indonesia and ASEAN while Trump threatened. Carney positioned Canada as a bridge between North America and Asia, a $500 billion investment target, while Trump burned bridges with allies. The man who claimed tariffs were the most beautiful word in the dictionary just learned they're also the most expensive. The question now isn't whether Trump will roll back the tariffs, it's whether voters will believe he ever had a plan at all. Because when your own central bank publishes a report that destroys your economic narrative one day before you start retreating, that's not strategy, that's collapse. And the steel sheets stacked in American warehouses, they're not just metal, they're a monument to what happens when political theater meets economic reality. Trump's never back down brand just bent under the weight of 90%, the percentage of his tariff bill that Americans, not foreigners, were forced to pay. Do you think Trump's tariff rollback is a tactical retreat or an admission that the strategy failed? From the start,